Right now, somewhere, a child is sitting in a row, perfectly still, staring at a clock, waiting for a bell to give them permission to move. You were that child. For 12 years of your life, you sat in rows, you raised your hand to speak, you even raised your hand to ask an adult for permission to use the bathroom, to attend to your own body. And nobody, not once, told you that was strange. It was just school. But stop and look at it the way you'd look at some foreign country's bizarre ritual, and a question rises up that you can't unsee. Who designed this, and what was it actually for? Picture a boy, 8 years old, by the window. The sun is out, a bird just landed on the sill, but he can't turn his head, because in this room, turning your head is a crime. So he watches the clock. He has learned to watch the clock. And when the bell rings, he doesn't feel free. He feels released, like a machine being switched off. That boy is you. That boy is almost everyone alive in the last 200 years. And here's the part nobody told you. That room, that silence, that bell, none of it was built to make you smart. It was built to make you obey. We even have it in writing, from the men who designed it. We'll get to that. But first you have to see what a child actually is. For 99% of human history, there were no schools at all, and kids learned everything anyway. A psychologist named Peter Gray spent years studying how children grew up in hunter-gatherer bands, and what he found should be carved over the door of every classroom. Those children were never made to sit still, never tested, graded, or ranked. They learned by doing the one thing children are built to do. They played. They trailed after the older kids, copied the adults, asked 1,000 questions, and taught themselves to hunt, to forage, to read the land and stay alive, on pure, self-directed curiosity. Picture a 5-year-old in one of those groups, handling a real knife, tending a real fire, roaming the forest in a pack of mixed ages, trusted, unsupervised, completely absorbed. They weren't behind. By every measure that mattered, they were years ahead of the children we now call educated. Children, it turns out, are not empty jars you fill. They are fires that light themselves. So what happened? Why did we take the most curious creature on earth and lock it in a silent room? The answer isn't an education story. It's a war story. In 1806, Napoleon crushed the Prussian army at the Battle of Jena, and Prussia was humiliated. Its leaders sat down to figure out why they lost, and they reached a chilling conclusion. They had lost, they decided, because their people thought too much for themselves. Soldiers had hesitated. Citizens had questioned. So Prussia set out to build something the world had never seen. Not a school to make people wise, but a machine to make people obey. A philosopher named Johann Fichte laid out the blueprint in a famous series of speeches. The goal of this new education, he said, was to mold the will of the child so completely that disobedience would become unthinkable. Picture exactly what they wanted. A citizen who would stand in a line for hours without complaint, follow an order from a man he'd never met, and feel a flash of panic at the very thought of stepping out of place. You don't get that from books. You get it from years of daily practice, starting when the child is too young to notice it's happening. Mandatory, state-run, sorted by age, driven by bells. It worked, terrifyingly well, and then the rest of the world came to look. In 1843, an American reformer named Horace Mann traveled to Prussia, watched the system running, and came home dazzled. He didn't see the obedience machine. He saw order, efficiency, control, and he carried it back to America, starting in Massachusetts, and from there it spread across the entire planet. Within a couple of generations, it stopped looking like a choice at all. It became simply what childhood was, so total, so universal, that almost no one alive could imagine raising a child any other way. The silent rows, the ringing bells, the sorting by age. Almost every school on Earth today is a copy of a machine built to rebuild a beaten army. And then came the factories, and the machine finally found its true calling. The 19th century needed millions of workers who would show up on time, stand at one station, repeat one motion for hours, and never, ever talk back. Where do you train a human to do that? You start at 5 years old. The school bell was not a metaphor for the factory whistle. It was the same idea on purpose, teaching children to start and stop their whole lives at the sound of a ring. And this is the part I promised you, because they wrote it down. In 1916, one of the most influential men in American education, Ellwood Cubberley, described what schools were for. I'm going to quote him directly. "Schools," he wrote, "are factories in which the raw products, children, are to be shaped and fashioned into finished products according to the specifications of manufacturing." Children, raw products, specifications. That is not a conspiracy theory whispered online. That is a sentence written proudly in a textbook by one of the architects of the system you grew up inside. And once you see children as product, everything else clicks. They were batched by birth year, like this season's model coming off the line. The curriculum was standardized, so every unit came out the same. The exam was invented as quality control, a stamp of pass or fail on the finished good. A child stopped being a person growing at their own pace. They became inventory, moving down a belt, measured against a spec sheet they never agreed to. So here's the part that's genuinely hard to sit with. A teacher named John Taylor Gatto spent 30 years in New York classrooms and was named State Teacher of the Year. And then he quit and spent the rest of his life explaining what he believed school actually teaches. Not math, not history. Those, he said, are the cover story. The real curriculum is hidden, and it goes far deeper. That you must surrender your attention the instant you're told. That knowledge flows down from an authority and never up from you. That your curiosity has to wait for permission. Remember raising your hand to use the bathroom. That was the lesson, not biology, obedience. You were being taught every single day that your time, your attention, even your own body now belonged to someone else and could only be reclaimed on their schedule. You didn't just learn subjects in that room. You learned your place. So think back to that bored kid by the window, watching the clock, waiting to be switched off. You were told you were lazy, distracted, not living up to your potential. But you were none of those things. You were a wild, curious, self-teaching animal, the same creature that taught itself to survive on the open savanna with no classroom at all. And you were set down on a factory floor and ordered to sit still. The restlessness you felt was never a defect. It was the most human part of you, refusing to be processed. And here's the cruelest twist of all. The factories that built this system are mostly gone now. The assembly lines moved overseas or vanished into machines. But the school built to feed them is still running, still ringing its bell, still sorting children into rows, still training them every single morning for a world that no longer exists. Your ancestors learned by chasing whatever set them on fire, with no walls and no schedule, and they became everything a human can become. You were handed a clock and told to wait. The bird is still on the windowsill. Nobody is forcing you to watch the clock anymore. The only question left is whether you still remember how to stand up and go after what you actually love.